Hi everyone and welcome to another episode of From the Lighthouse. I am here with my lovely co-host Michelle. Hi Michelle.
Hi Stephanie.
And we are today talking about the Man Booker Prize 2017. So the long list was released in July and Michelle and I have been studiously reading as many as we can possibly get through in the time that we have, which is not much. And the shortlist is just about to be announced on the 13th of September. So we thought we'd have this little conversation about the long list while there still exists a long list. So, Michelle, what were your thoughts generally, I suppose, about the Booker Prize? Is this something that interests you? Is this something that you ordinarily read your way through?
Look, I think that it's something that if you're interested in literature, you need to think about. And I was contemplating it as I was coming here this morning, and I was thinking about all the different ways of what it actually means to measure literature in some sense. To what are the criteria of a prize-winning book? Is it to do with literature? Is it to do where do we locate value? Is it economic in terms of sales? Is it moral? Because I think that for me and I think for you too, we're always a little bit uneasy about books that seem to be awarded for their moral standpoint.
Definitely.
For reasons that we'll probably talk about. And then is it literary? And then how do we discuss the literary, where so often the popular reader, the sort of the every person reader eschews the literary as being sort of without meaning or without import, and sort of too esoteric.
Yeah, I mean, I think these conversations are really interesting. And I mean, what's interesting about the Booker Prize is the prize that traditionally has had the biggest impact on sales. So according to some research that we did, or that more accurately Michelle did for this podcast, Paul Beatty, who won the Booker Prize last year for The Sellout, his sales increased a whopping 658%, which is
kind of astronomical, isn't it?
It's unbelievable. Yeah. So, I mean, I think we need to kind of think seriously about what kinds of books win prizes. And traditionally, like, much of the conversation has been around the dearth of women and women writers winning prizes, and also the kind of domination of these prizes by white male writers. So I think that's an interesting conversation that still needs to happen.
Well, and it's also really, I think that the Booker Prize, when you look at it in relation to other prizes, say for example the Goncourt Prix in Paris, where it's in France, where it's always been very much based on a notion of cultural value that has virtually nothing to do with how popular a book is, and in fact is indicative of how sort of how much it's about the sort of the cultural prestige, whatever we think of as cultural prestige. It's not about money. It's not about getting bigger sales necessarily. It seems to be that there's a much a much more defined notion, or a much more constructed notion of a literary text. Whereas I think with the Booker Prize, there is this sort of link of the Booker Prize as a way of raising the profile of writers.
Yeah, I agree. I think
literature itself.
Yeah, I think there's a very strong link that the Booker draws out between the novels that are long-listed, shortlisted, but certainly the one that wins, to sales. I think that's how they place kind of value on books, extending the notion and the profile out to the kind of wider audience. And I've noticed here too.
Betting. My goodness,
I know.
I've never bet on anything, but I'm sort of tempted to
I know.
make my
well,
first
I feel
foray into the betting world.
I feel this is the only topic upon which I could bet with any kind of knowledge, behind me.
The odds might be with you as opposed to against you.
It won't be just, I like that horse's colour or number. It would be, I've actually read this book and I think it might have a chance. But it's certainly it's interesting to read. You've done some digging up of information from the Booker Prize website, and it says that the Booker Prize aims to reward merit, raise the stature of the author in the eyes of the public, and increase the sale of books. Yeah. So it's certainly one of the key kind of focuses is bringing these books that might not necessarily be visible to the public, the broader public, and raising the profile of that author and connecting that to sales. So there is a huge commercial imperative kind of built into the award.
And I think also there's a huge consideration of the public, which I guess to me, and it's funny because we're both lovers of literature, and I know that we're both passionate about what we think the literary does, sort of for any culture, for any society. And yet I guess my unease with that sort of aim of appeasing perhaps a public or choosing a book based on something like readability, I guess, is that idea that it becomes a little bit like a sort of a messy democracy.
Yeah, Julian Barnes calls it posh bingo.
Yeah. And I think that it sort of also gets to that idea where we sort of end up with, just as we end up with politicians who are trying to second guess what the public wants.
Yeah.
Is there that sort of notion as well in terms of what issues we think are going to ignite a public? And
what's
that's the
relevant.
Should.
Yeah.
And I always feel that with the literary, I have this sense that in the end, and I think this is one of the things that will distinguish for me which books I want to see go forward, it's the books that have this sort of intrinsic need to be written as opposed to this sensation that they should be written, or that they should say this, or that they, because I think almost in without exception, any time that I found a sort of a weak spot in a book, it was where I felt they were doing something that they thought they should do, as opposed to what that particular sort of literary text needed to do at that point in time.
And there's certainly been kind of years where I felt that the winner was dictated more by kind of cultural and social factors. In fact, probably every year the winner is dictated by a lot of cultural and social factors that surround the books rather than just the books themselves. So, for example, The Sellout, which won last year, now I think that was a very fine novel, but I think it was also a novel that was felt to be particularly important because of the cultural context. So it's a kind of messy and complicated conversation. And there's been, I was looking at the list of winners from the past, and it's interesting to see that some of them have remained kind of central key touchstone texts. But some of them I thought, that sunk like that sunk like a stone. No one's read that for 30 years. So it can be very touch and go. And I remember there was a controversy a few years ago. Stella Duffy was on the, I think, the chair of the panel, and there was all this kind of talk about readability. And she put forward her ideas about readability in a way that suggested that the prize in the past had gone to non-readable books, and that she was, as chair in that particular year, now I can't remember what year it was, but in that particular year that she was stressing the kind of importance of readability, which is a very kind of interesting kind of valuation, and says all sorts of things about what we perceive the reader, the common reader, to want, and what we place value on, and where the kind of Booker Prize is situated in the kind of literary landscape. It suggests that, at least in that year, that there was more of a kind of attempt to pitch it as a kind of middle brow thing rather than a kind of highbrow literary engagement, I suppose. So these things are always influenced. I suppose what I'm saying here is these things are always influenced by factors outside of the books as much as they're they're influenced by factors inside the books.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think that it's essential to the process that is the fact. I mean, we're always, I guess, I always think of that notion of you're sort of always aiming for a literature to come.
Yeah. And
so, which is why I always get uncomfortable about books that feel like they're sort of trying to please rather than be. And I think that at the same time, when we're always recognising the sort of the inherent flaws of any one historical point in time, you are lobbying for change, and there are really sort of important criteria to take into account where books do matter, because it is part of that attempt to change a literary landscape that has been dominated by white men.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's why I think that it was important and significant that the sellout won last year, because it was a book that was so explicitly not about white men. It was written by a black man, and it was about the African American experience. And I think that was very timely that it won in that particular year. But like I said, these considerations sort of exist in the context, in the culture, as well as within the actual kind of merit, in inverted commas, of the books themselves.
Yeah, and it's really I think it's impossible to extricate sort of any form of sort of value allotting system from its context.
Exactly.
So
those things are inseparable.
As though there's some sort of neutrally great concept of literature. That isn't always going to be filled in with lots of criteria that actually have histories and political context.
That's right. It's impossible to read these things divorced from context. Yeah. And these things are inextricably related to context, and there's so much that's sort of interesting to think about why particular texts speak to us at particular moments in time, and why those texts that I referenced that have kind of fallen off kind of cultural awareness, and some texts have remained. But I think that this is a kind of good segue into going through the long list. I've read 10 of them. I think you've read something like that.
Yeah.
And to discuss our thoughts on each of the nominated books and which ones we feel should go through. So we're going to go through these in alphabetical order for the sake, or I think as close to alphabetical order as we accidentally put it in, for the sake of fairness. And we're starting off then with, I should say there are 13 books on the long list, the Man Book a dozen, so to speak. So we're starting off with 4321 by Paul Auster. I have to confess this is one of the three I haven't read.
Yep. And I've actually sat down and read almost the first chapter, but that's
very
also
impressive.
Yeah. Well, look, it was only time that stopped me from going further, and yet I think, Paul Auster is really an author that I grew up with.
Yeah.
I remember sort of reading him in my 20s, in my first sort of university days. And I think that there's no doubt that there is that feel of someone who is a craftsman, and his prose is elegant, and it's it has a weight to it. And I without a doubt, we'll both be reading that. But it's also interesting that when we were sort of, I guess, selecting or prioritising, because at some point
you have to make decisions.
There were the prioritising. It was the one that I let slip, and I don't know if it's because that there's that feeling of familiarity with Auster that I felt, well, definitely get there with a shortlist, and I was anxious to read because there are lots of new novelists on this. Yeah,
there are lots of debut novelists, or at least new to us, kind of not as kind of well known as the others.
For example, George Sanders, who makes his foray into the novel after short stories.
Well, the reason that made me put that down the pile is because it's really long. I have to admit, I'm not averse to a long book. I love a long book. In fact, I have a tote bag that says I love big books, and I cannot lie, because I am very mature. But when you have to get through 13 books in a very short amount of time in order to prepare for a podcast, length does prohibit one picking it up. So that's why I haven't picked it up.
I think it is also that theme as well, because I wasn't sure that I was in the state of mind to commit to a sort of a Bildungsroman of that nature.
It is a big commitment. To go into an 800,
but also that theme, I guess, where it is an acknowledgement of the context, where the story of sort of the little boy growing up,
and he grows up 4 different ways. So that's the conceit of the novel, is that it's 4 different versions of his life. So there is kind of a lot of work to be done there, and you've really got to be into that kind of story, I suppose.
The subtlety and the micro details, and I think that one of the stories that I adored was actually Reservoir
Yeah.
13.
Well, shall we skip to Reservoir 13 then?
Well, I was thinking that there was that sense of sort of known themes, sort of adolescent or near adolescent girls going missing, and so of course you're sort of walking these well-worn paths, but at the same time all the way through, the combination of prose and the combination of the I guess there was just such a atmosphere.
Yes.
And
yeah.
Such an atmosphere and such a sense of I guess just a sense of an author who knows right from the start what they want to do.
Yeah, so backing up a little bit, this is Reservoir. We're jumping now to Reservoir 13 by John McGregor, who is a UK author. And this is a novel that kind of sets itself up initially, or it looks like initially it's going to be about a missing girl, which is kind of the most overdone, perhaps, kind of story that you can imagine. So it's about a missing teenage girl called Rebecca Shaw. However, it's not actually about a missing teenage girl. In actual fact, what it's about is about the town, the kind of country, rural town that she's gone missing within. And it's about the lives of the people that are affected by the disappearance. And it's about time. It's about nature. It took me a good 30 pages to figure out what was happening. But once I was into the kind of rhythm of the novel, and I realised what was happening, and we were going to just follow these people's lives in and out across time. I think it runs through 13 years. 13 years. And, you're going to see marriages fall apart, marriages formed, children born, people die, all of these kinds of things that happen in the general course of time. It's beautiful. I thought it was a wonderful book. I thought it was written brilliantly. I ended up absolutely loving it. And it's one that I keep thinking about. I keep thinking about those people.
Afterlife.
Yeah.
And I think, it sounds as though without too much surprise, I think it's one that I'd love to see shortlisted.
I'd love to see it shortlisted too, and it was kind of not what I was expecting, and I thought it was brilliantly handled. And I keep thinking about the people in the town.
Yep.
And how I wanted to stay with them.
But for me, I think it sort of encapsulates what I love about somebody who really writes, and it's that feeling that the subtext is so profound and like deep waters. It's there from the beginning. And I had this little snippet from McGregor where he said, I'm sure it was from the Guardian review of his book, where he said, I'm allergic to making points in fiction. And at that point I wanted to kiss him. So I think that's what I felt with this book.
Yeah.
It was doing what it needed to do.
And at the end it's about, but in such a beautiful way. I mean, I didn't want it to do anything more than what it did. And for me, I actually don't usually respond well to descriptions of landscape in novels, because I often get quite bored by them. But the way he describes the atmosphere and the changes that happen and the seasonal changes that happen, when it gets colder and gets warmer and all of that.
Because he all the way through, every one of those descriptions is only it is a description with metaphoric import. Because when you're reading about this changing of the seasons, you know that you're reading about what it means to be mortal.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a real sense of like, this isn't here to kind of show off how good I am about writing nature descriptions, but it's actually part of the landscape of the novel. I really ended up. At first, I thought, I don't know what this is about, but once I was past that initial kind of confusion, I just fell into this book and loved it, and I really hope it makes the shortlist.
Absolutely.
Shall we talk about Days Without End by Sebastian Barry? Have you read this?
I've only read 4 chapters, so
okay.
But I've had a sort of a little bit of a hunt around and etc. So I feel as though
you feel like you've read it.
Loved the prose. For me, one of the things that has to work is you've got to have that magic that feels both sort of original and right, but also timeless. And I think he did that with that.
Well, I liked the prose too. I've read the whole book. It's an American Civil War book. So, well, it eventually becomes an American Civil War book. What I found with this book, I read it quite a long time ago, so before it was nominated for the Man Booker. I really liked it at first, but the more it became about war, the less I liked it. I think this is actually a me thing, because I find it really hard to read about war. For some reason, whenever, like, a book, a novel turns to descriptions of battles and so forth, my brain just shuts down. I think I'm just not engaged by writing about warfare. I can't visualize it. I can't engage with it. And so the more it became about the war, the less I engaged with it.
That could happen to me. I did actually love War and Peace, but I think that the only scene of war that actually sticks with me is the moment when I think Nikolai's looking up at the sky and it's blue. you know, because I have a similar
because you've looked up at the sky and it's been blue.
Well, I'm kind of like you in the sense that I am not interested by war.
I'm not interested by war, and I mean, I read it because it had been highly recommended by various people. But I didn't find myself enjoying it. I found myself bored by a lot of it. I did like the kind of initial chapters. I did kind of like the conceit. So without giving too much away, it's about two soldiers who develop a relationship. And so I liked the conceit. I liked the writing. But the more it became about war, the less it kind of enthralled me. So I found myself kind of really liking it at first and then falling away.
Oh dear, now that I know that so much of it.
I know. Sorry.
No.
It may just be my thing. Other people have loved it.
I think I share a sort of it's just I'm not interested in reading war.
Yeah, I can't visualize it. I can't imagine what it's like. I've always had this problem. I can't recall. I mean, I can read war books, but I mostly read war books about the home front, so I just can't kind of get into that.
Would you want to see it shortlisted, do you think? Or there's just more that you...
There's more that I liked. I liked a lot on this long list, to be honest, and so I'd rather something else. And I think Sebastian Barry, like, I know this is kind of one of those external considerations, but Sebastian Barry has quite a lively career already, and so I'd like to kind of see somebody like John McGregor, who wrote Reservoir 13, kind of come to the forefront of literary consciousness a bit more than perhaps Barry, who's already got a big following.
Yeah, look, I think that, but I actually think that's a very valid thing to think about when we've just spoken about what the goal of part of the
prize
goal
exactly
is.
Yeah.
All
right, so next on our list we have History of Wolves by Emily Friedland, who is a US author. Have you read this? No. Okay, I have. So I just finished reading this about a fortnight ago. So this is a book about a teenager who becomes enthralled in this family. She becomes involved with this family who moves in to the house basically across the way. She lives in Minnesota, in a rural area. It's very cold constantly. And she becomes involved in the lives of these people who have a 4-year-old, and she babysits the 4-year-old. I really liked the concept of the book. I didn't like the book that much. I thought it was really well written. On a prose level, I really enjoyed it. But for me, the plot was all over the place. So there is a kind of, again, without spoiling it too much for listeners, there is a kind of central problem or central incident that happens. You know what that is fairly early on. So say about halfway through, it becomes clear what's happened with the young boy. But it's managed in this sort of strange way that didn't really work for me. I found it a bit anticlimactic. The young girl she's narrating from an experience. She's narrating a teenage experience from the perspective of herself when she's in her late 30s. I didn't think the time shifts were handled particularly well. I didn't really see the point of it being narrated, the backwards and forwards, and I didn't think those shifts were handled particularly well. I found it a bit anticlimactic. She becomes really interested in a teacher who is, she discovers quite early on, so it's not really a spoiler, has had pedophilia charges laid against him, and she becomes very supportive of this teacher in ways that didn't really make sense to me. So she tries to kind of keep up with him throughout her life, and he is involved with a student at the school, etc. So I found this book a bit messy. It's a debut novel, which might account for the messiness. I think that Emily Friedland is a really good writer on a kind of prose craft level. But for me, there was a bit too much messiness about the plotting, too much kind of not very subtly conveyed, this is the important point that I want you to think about kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it didn't work for me as much as it might have. I found it quite enjoyable to read on a kind of, I'm sitting down and reading on a Saturday afternoon kind of way. Mm-hmm. But it didn't really rise to the level of other books on this list.
Yeah.
So I kind of think that this one won't go through. And I've seen a few reviews that kind of share it was fine but not great kind of assessment of it. So my prediction is that it won't go through to the shortlist, but who knows? What do I know?
Look, and I mean, I think it's interesting because already we're starting to see that perhaps there are other considerations in terms of compiling this long list.
Yeah.
Sort of raising the stature of particular authors.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think you can see with sort of the relatively newly sort of transatlantic sort of edition of American.
Yeah, because that's only been in for the American books have only been eligible for 2 or 3 years, I think. Yeah.
2014. 2014 or so. So I think that's when you step back from that long list and you look at it from the perspective of sort of geography, when you think about it from sort of demographics, when you think about when you think about it in terms of divides between urban and rural, in terms of sort of American history, in terms of you can sort of see that we are starting to get a sort of, I guess, a richer fray, I guess, out of the 13.
And I'm certainly like to read what this author does in the
it's not often that I guess
a book about a teenager.
Story.
Yeah, that's right. And it is very much a teenage story. I'd like to read what Emily Friedland does after this, but I just kind of feel like it screamed debut novel to me in ways that made me want to read what she does in the future, which is good, but also made me think that this is not as refined as it could have been.
And I think that is important. I mean, it doesn't matter what sort of criteria you have. I think that a certain level of proficiency has to be maintained before sort of you can go forward to that long list. I mean, would you have long-listed her?
Probably not.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of good writing out there, so I probably wouldn't have. I mean, I can think of other books that I've read this year that have got to me more than this. Yeah. We have to kick along because we have 13 of these to get through.
Yeah, I know.
So we've got Exit West by Mohsin Hamid, who is a Pakistani UK writer. Have you read this?
Yeah,
I have.
I absolutely
we've
have,
both read this. So this is a really interesting book. It's got magical realism elements.
Speculative, it's sort of futuristic, and yet also utterly sort of deliberately realist as well.
Yeah, so it's about immigration and migration, I suppose, and the idea that the only kind of magical realist element is that there are these portals that open up that allow the people in the story to flit between cities, to step into a portal and step out into another country. So we have our two main characters are Saeed and Nadia, who kind of end up in a quasi-relationship with each other because there is a war happening in their unnamed city. I really liked this novel. I'm not sure what you thought of it. I actually like it more in retrospect than I did while I was reading it. It's the kind of thing where it's very simple. I found it was very simply written, but it stayed with me. I find myself thinking about this novel a lot.
Yeah, I think that when I sort of step back from it, because I think that it is that. I think it's quite sort of beautiful plain prose, because I think that there's prose, and I think there's examples of some cliche prose amongst the long list.
Yeah.
But I think that that Exit West keeps to that sort of deliberately clean.
Yeah, it's very
sort
passed
of prose.
down, and
Yep. And I think too that there are so many profound transformations that occur in a very slim novel. And we actually do watch a city that sort of could conceivably have been Iran. It could conceivably have been Syria. It could have been, because it's very much a city living under Sharia law.
It's certainly in an Islamic city.
And a lot of the I guess the aspects of Islam are handled very concretely, and the very different ways of experiencing Islamic law in the city, and the characters' experiences of that law, I think was done really deftly, because I think that it's hard to convey to a Western audience the degree to which aspects of Islamic law that can seem constraining or impossible to endure from a Western perspective are actually loved, and are not only loved but are sort of chosen. Because obviously Nadia very deliberately chooses to wear the chador. No, she doesn't wear the chador because she doesn't. I think, does she cover her head? But anyway, she's got the black robe, and she maintains that black robe even though she's not the religious one out of the two of them.
And she maintains it when she doesn't have to.
And she maintains it when she doesn't have to, and she maintains it when she crosses to London, when she crosses back, when she lives. And I think that takes great skill and insight in order to do that. And I think also watching the way that cities, I guess the tipping points in a city and in change, of change, and I think that's something that he captures. And what becomes so brilliant about the way he does that, I think, is the way that we see that happen in a London that is so close to being London. And I think that's the thing all the way through. The cities that he represents are so close to being the cities.
Yeah, but there's something just not a bit off.
But it's not even that. He takes it that one bit further because he pushes them past those points.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think that the London that he portrays is an incredibly vital London.
Yeah,
because I think there's a real failure. I think there's a real failure of the imagination in a lot of sort of more privileged nations to understand the degree to which the pressure of sort of refugees and the immensity, the scale of human sort of human I guess homelessness, of human exile.
It's very much of its exile. Yeah, it's very much of its time. I think this is a novel that's very apt at the moment to read. But I also thought that those sections where he's talking about London and how it's changed because of this kind of free movement that is allowed through these portals are brilliant. But what actually hit me more is the relationship between Saeed and Nadia in all its kind of complexity. So the relationship, nitty-gritty detail, and so realistic. The way that their relationship develops, the way that it dissipates or unravels, I suppose, without giving too much away about what actually happens. But the way that their relationship transforms itself over time and in these extraordinary circumstances, to me, was brilliant and really very, in the same time as we're dealing with magical realism, it was so realistic. Yeah, those human relationships. I thought that I loved this book. I really, it's the one that sort of stuck in my head the longest, I think.
Yeah, and there was something very enabling. It wasn't for the way that characters moved through portals. So that within a space of a few hours they could end up from the unnamed sort of perhaps Persian city to a Greek island, to London. The way that he chose his destinations. It is very also the afterlife of Exit West, and because it was so enabling and it's not so far from the truth, because the reality is that distances are navigated very easily.
Yeah, that's right. Today,
24 hours, and the only thing that sort of creates these hurdles or that ends up with people sort of gathered on the frontiers or on the other side of the barbed wire is in actual fact all of the sort of the customs and the
Yeah,
immigration
that's right.
law
These kind of fake
because in actual fact
things,
it's very
barriers
easier to travel.
That's
to
right.
move. So I thought that was a beautiful book.
All right, so moving swiftly along as
We
we're
definitely
fast
want that
running.
one to be shortlisted.
We want that to be shortlisted. So running out of time, so we have to really
Yep.
pick up the speed. Solar Bones by Mark McCormack. He's an Irish writer. This book has become famous because it's the single sentence novel.
Yep.
So the entire novel is written as a single sentence. We only get a full stop right at the end. I loved this book. I thought I was going to hate it because I thought, what a gimmick. Ended up absolutely adoring this book. Read it over a day. What did you think?
Yep, absolutely. And I think it's so easy for something like
The single
sentence to turn into a gimmick where it's just about look what I can do.
Yep.
And in actual fact, I think that it became it sort of became a significant part. It was enmeshed in the very being of the book. So,
yeah, I couldn't imagine it any other way. So it's about a man reflecting on his life and his thoughts, in the kind of classic modernist stream of consciousness style.
It's so
thoughts.
readable, not hard, not hard prose, not alienating prose.
And it's entirely natural the way his thoughts move from one subject or one kind of recollection to another. It's kind of so beautiful to read.
I was going to say, but it is also, I think, aesthetically beautiful because something that it sort of in some way intensifies the word on the page. I think in a way that, and it's so pared back. It is so pared back, and it gives it a beautiful. It's like it looks sort of, there's something skeletal about it, I guess.
Yeah, no, I absolutely ended up adoring this book. One of my favourites from the long list in ways that I didn't expect. But it's impossible to imagine the book having the impact that it has if it was written any other way. I think it's just must.
I mean, literature's always had an engagement with death. I mean, it always has. It's sort of, I think that anyone who's spent even the smallest amount of time thinking about what literature does will have thought about its role in terms, its way of considering death, for mortality, immortality through art, all of those sorts of things. And yet I think you would have to say that this year's long list has a sort of a fairly heavy, and in a very varied way, because I mean, if you think about how differently death is both central to a novel, but also portrayed in a way that is quite different to the way that the other authors have portrayed it.
Absolutely. So I think we'll take up that point when we get to a few later down the list. The next we have is Element by Fiona Mosley. I haven't read this book.
No.
I have to admit I know very little about it. I know she's a UK debut novelist, I think, and it's a British Gothic. Set in Yorkshire. I think it's about a family, but apart from that, I do not know.
No.
If it makes it to the shortlist.
There's a Ted Hughes. I know that it's referencing Ted Hughes' cycle of poems. And
yeah, possibly.
Yep.
If it gets to the shortlist, I will read it and do my due diligence.
Well, I think I'll read it anyway, but unfortunately, hours in the day.
But that's right, and we have jobs and all that, unfortunately, that impact upon our reading time. So the next one on my list is, again, another one I haven't read. I don't think you've read this either. This is The Ministry of Utmost Happiness by Arundhati Roy.
No, but do you know, I'm not a great Arundhati Roy fan. So
I'm not either.
And unfortunately, that was, and I will still read it because I feel on principle one needs.
Well, now we've signed up to this.
Well,
we have to,
exactly. But also, we don't just read books that we think we're going to like. Because otherwise, you're never going to be,
challenged.
Challenged. So so that alone is not enough to stop me from reading it. But it did mean that it wasn't on my top.
Yeah, it wasn't on my top list either. I didn't find The God of Small Things very readable. I didn't really enjoy that many years ago whenever it came out. But it's one that will definitely...
I'm glad we confess these things.
Yeah, we are. Look, we're being very honest here. All right, so now Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders.
Yeah.
We've both read this.
Yep.
So this is about the death of Abraham Lincoln's son, Willie, and it's a really interesting polyphonic novel. So it's a novel narrated by many, many different characters. I think there's about 150 different characters.
So many different voices.
Collage
effects with historical accounts, memoir, scholarship mixed in with...
fake scholarship. I loved this book.
Yeah, I did too.
I adored it. It took me, again, about 30 pages to understand what the kind of vibe of the book is, I suppose. After that, I absolutely loved it. It's sad, it's funny, it's clever, it's one of the...
It's bawdy. It's so bawdy.
So bawdy.
It's so fantastically bawdy.
Especially, we won't give away the kind of joke about Hans Vollmann. You'll have to read the book. in order to find
tempting
out.
to-
No, we're not giving it away because we want people to read it, and it's worth.
I don't know. I
discovering.
think I'd be tempted to read it once I'd heard. No, anyway,
we won't.
Thank
We
you,
won't give it
Stephanie,
away.
for being so disciplined.
I am very disciplined. I'm going to stop you from giving it away because it's worth finding out. But it's wonderful.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not hard to, even though you got so many voices, so many stories, and these are mostly voices of people who've died and are sitting in the bardo, which is a kind of midway point between being alive and going to the next reincarnation in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. So it's, you know, all of these,
like a multicultural religious extravaganza, because in actual fact, I think that was one of the things that I loved, because sometimes I felt myself going, oh no, this. Because one of the things that the ghosts do, that Saunders has them do, is that when they actually sort of go to disappear from the bardo, they go through their future forms as well as sort of the things that they might have been had they not have died. And, you know, initially when that started happening, I started thinking, I don't think that's right. Yeah. And then I thought, for goodness sake, you know, that's such a that's a very sort of Euro-Christian centric way of looking at things, because in actual fact, sort of tied into that notion of reincarnation and what might happen, that it's absolutely vital that in imagining that afterlife, that it's not dictated to by a sort of a Western or Christian logic, in a sense. And so he does. He has an extraordinary imagination.
Oh, it's so inventive, that scene where I can't remember his name. I've got it written down here.
Is it Coleman or the...
No, it is... Oh, where is it? I've lost it. The preacher who goes to a form of Judgment Day, which is just so funny and so brilliantly imagined. I mean, I would be very surprised if this doesn't make the shortlist.
I would probably be gutted and swear off the Book of Man, Book of Prize for at least a little while.
We probably wouldn't have a 2018 show.
Well, we would definitely talk about not having a 2018 show.
Yeah, that's right, in our outrage.
We'd be so in our outrage and then probably do it.
And it's so sad. At its heart, this is a story about grief of a father for his son, and it's beautiful and sad and...
Challenging because it doesn't give in to sentimentality. It gives us these little glimpses of other people's opinions of who Willie was, of
That's
who
right.
Lincoln
it's
was.
a real master craftsman at work, and I feel very privileged to read it.
That is the discipline of the short story. You know, I think that
he's come out of the short story tradition, and he knows exactly what he's doing.
Yeah, and I think that there were a few moments where I felt as though in that book there were moments where things happened that should happen rather than needed to happen. And I think because there was such brilliant, like the brilliant representation of the slave who was just raped mercilessly, brutally, and so the story of her rape told to us so graphically. That and it felt so intrinsic to the story, and then I felt that there were some moments when the sort of, I guess, the story was, I feel like sometimes the characters were made to do things that they didn't actually need or should do within the realm of that marvellous story world. So I don't know. I just, there were just a couple of moments which I don't want to give away where I did feel.
But overall,
overall, and in actual fact, I don't think that in any way deterred, because I think if you were going to preclude stories based on whether they have flaws, then you'd never read Crime and Punishment.
That's right.
Never read half the books.
I mean,
there's
no perfect novel.
No, so that's just a curiosity, a sort of a small. Yeah.
So moving on quickly, Swing Time by Zadie Smith. We talked about this in our Best Books of 2016 show. I really loved this book. You did not love this book as much?
No.
So this is about...
It left me a little bit indifferent.
Yeah, so this is about Tracy and Amy and their... the narrator and's relationship to her friend Tracy, as well as her relationship to a celebrity called Amy. It's set in London. It's set in Africa. I don't think we'll talk about it much here because we have talked about it before. So please listen to our Best Books of 2016 show if you want to hear why I loved it and why Michelle didn't.
Not that I didn't. I enjoyed it, but I didn't love it.
Well, I have to say, having read a lot of other books on the shortlist. Long list. I probably wouldn't shortlist it because I think there are better kind of more innovative, braver novels.
Yep.
Another book that we've already discussed at length was The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. So we had a whole show on that. And the story of Cora and Caesar, and set on a slave plantation. Again, there's a magical realist dimension to this novel, where the Underground Railroad is an actual railroad. So, again, probably won't talk much about that, but I believe that we both loved it.
Yeah, we did. But we
did.
Second.
I mean, again,
I'd love to.
I'd love to see it shortlisted. I would be very surprised, considering it won the Pulitzer this year, quite recently. Then I would be very surprised if it wasn't shortlisted. So that's another really strong choice. Okay, we have 2 more to get through and only 9 minutes to go.
We can do this. Definitely.
We can do this. Yeah. The next one is Autumn by Ali Smith.
Yeah.
So that's in usual Ali Smith style. It's kind of brilliantly, inventively written. It's about 2 main characters, Elizabeth and an older man that she befriends called Daniel. It's part of a seasonal quartet that Smith is writing. So she's writing
Quartet to Come.
Yeah, Quartet to Come. So she's writing winter at the moment. Also lauded as one of the first post-Brexit novels. What did you think of Autumn?
Yeah, look, I loved it, and I think that's something that you can feel in the prose of Ali Smith is that she writes and she must write, and so she does write, and she gets things out. Do you know what I mean? Like she to have this story published so quickly, following on from the EU referendum, I think is. Not all authors can do it, not all authors should do it, but my goodness, isn't it marvellous for a public that some authors can?
Yeah, and you know what? Some of these books where they're commenting, I suppose, quite directly on a political moment, like some of the post 9/11 books didn't work for me because I felt like
they were preaching,
they were preaching, and I felt like 9/11 was just shoved in as a way of going, hey, I'm writing a 9/11 book now.
Yeah.
This just brilliantly worked. The way that the story is constructed around this relationship between initially the very young Elizabeth and the older man who lives next door, Daniel, I thought was just really lovely. The way she talks about befriending him and becoming involved in his life and researching this relationship he had with an artist. I thought it was deftly handled. The prose was brilliant.
It takes real skill, I think, to write politically, and she does, because it's not just the Brexit. It's also the artist that she so very much. I've forgotten.
Pauline
Boaty. There's something so very. There's something so very bold about the way that she takes on the reason why some artists don't, and often women artists, often sort of artists who sort of fall outside of sort of that pre-existing notion of elitism, and she takes that on and in a really in a really defiant manner, and
again we have a focus on death and that idea, and the idea of autumn in this is like the autumn of one's life and that kind of gradual kind of decline as you age. I thought it was lovely. Everything worked together.
Surreal, liminal, because it's a beautifully liminal book. Like she really gets, and that's the thing, that she doesn't just treat autumn in a sort of a facile manner. It really starts to pack a punch on. And
you're not sure where there's a sequence in which you're not sure if Daniel's actually dead or not.
Yeah.
And he's in this liminal state of imagining or hallucination, and you're not quite clear where he is. And even when it becomes kind of more clear what's actually happening, you still get that sense that we're on a kind of border space, or we're in border territory, and that idea of borders and Brexit and the politics of it is so kind of nicely handled, I thought.
Yeah, and then there's a beautiful moment which I think sort of it typifies what Smith does is, and Daniel is telling the young Elizabeth that we don't stereotype our characters. We don't pigeonhole. We give them the room
Yeah.
to be to
Which is exactly what she does.
And I think that because the mother, there is no character who
you think the mother's going to be one thing and she becomes something quite different.
Yeah, and we also see how Elizabeth also has her own very particular qualities that are not without consequence.
And she's not a perfect character. She's flawed in realistic ways. I think Ali Smith does character extremely well.
Yeah.
So I really enjoyed that. We have 4 minutes left. So 4 minutes to talk about our last Longlist, which is Home Fire by Camilla Shamsi. Just came out like last week. So I think we've both read this. You kindly lent me your copy. This is a contemporary retelling of the Antigone myth. It's about Isma, who is an older sister of twins called Amon and Anika, and their story becomes more and more kind of aligned to the Antigone myth as it goes along. So it's about terrorism, it's about grief, it's about death. I didn't actually very much enjoy this book. We had a little chat about it before. I thought the writing was very basic. I thought that didn't think there was anything too kind of innovative or interesting about the writing. It was very simple, easy to read, but nothing sort of beyond that.
Sort of basically the 5 sections of 5 characters.
Exactly.
And so I guess you've got the multiple perspective thing happening. But I guess that one of the things that happened for me was that none of the characters ended up with the sort of the complexity to withstand the sort of exaggerated plot.
The plot to me is so unlikely. I mean, without giving away what happens, it does follow the kind of broad outlines of the Antigone myth, and I just found myself thinking this is so unlikely and so over the top.
Well, I also worried me that on one hand it was deliberately, and I guess I perhaps have a little bit of a different perspective on this, just because I mean my husband is Muslim and he has been taken in for airport interrogation.
That's not the part that struck me as unlikely.
And this was the things. So when I say that I did find that there were too many parts improbable, it wasn't so much the fact that she couldn't have had a father who was in Guantanamo Bay, that she couldn't have had this, that she couldn't have that. But the problem was that when you bring those things onto the page, I feel that you have to be able to match them with story and character, and I didn't feel that happened. And that I think today, I think that's actually a really serious failing. I think it's a failing with consequences, because there were just lots of moments there where I thought this story is problematic, and I mean I think Antigone is such a powerful figure, and so I wanted it to happen, and I wanted it to work.
Well, see, I had a interview with the author, and she said, somebody suggested to me that I should write an Antigone, a modern day Antigone, so I did. I was like, but that's not a reason. You've got to have a reason that this novel, which is so much about terrorism on the one hand, kind of is married to Antigone. It's just, it struck me as like I wanted to write a novel about terrorism in its kind of clunky way. Yeah,
and I think that is the thing, because I mean, even sort of, because I tried to rationalise it and thinking, well, maybe she's gone back to sort of a dramatic structure where it's actually sort of, because obviously these days we very much have a focus on language and aesthetics and all of those sorts of things, and so she's stripped that back and she's gone back to sort of plot and action in a sort of Aristotelian way. But I thought even on even sort of reading it along those lines as a sort of a deliberate sort of tragedy, where you're stripping back the need to do, sort of, I guess, the stuff of modernism or the stuff of this or the stuff of that. Even when I take it back to there, I'm still not on the page with her.
Yeah, and I feel like the big climax of the novel, which happens right on the last page, I just felt like
it was clunky.
It was clunky. I felt it was unlikely. That's what I felt was unlikely.
Even knowing that in Greek drama, it was very possible for sort of these events to just happen and sort of outlandish sort of I guess complex sort of stunts to happen on stage, etc. But I just didn't feel that the story supported the final scene, and
it was like that was happening in an otherwise realist universe in ways that kind of were a bit at odds. I felt
some
like
of the things were too obvious. Some of the moments I thought were cliche.
Well, even the kind of explication of how the twin, the male twin, Parvez,
Yeah.
became a terrorist. I was like, this sounds like it's a story about why somebody is it is a cliche. It's like
it's a really simplistic representation, it's an oversimplification. Which
and
is
I felt like it was an instruction manual.
But also, it's such a dangerous thing to do in this time. I think.
Yeah, it was like somebody told her this is how terrorists are made, and so she went and wrote.
Because there's so many negative, like we live in a world where sort of there's real Islamophobia.
Yeah, and there's real consequences
to
this.
To feeding into a simpler, because you look at something like Exit West.
Yeah, and that's done with such nuance, and this is so he became a terrorist because this older man said this, and all. It kind of annoyed me actually. Let's hope that doesn't make the shortlist, huh?
Yeah, I would be really disappointed.
I would be disappointed too. There's so many good picks, and I just feel like this really didn't. It's an easy read. I breezed through it in like a day and a half. But it didn't really do much for me. We have completely run out of time.
Oh, what a shame.
Which is a shame, but we will be back with a shortlist show. So when the shortlist will be announced.
What will we say? We will have so much to
yeah, that's right. We'll have so much to expand upon. So when the shortlist is announced, we'll be doing another show that will go live just before the announcement of the winner, in which we'll go over the shortlist. We'll make our predictions as to who likely will win, and then the winner will be announced, and will probably be proven wrong. But that's something to look forward to anyway.
And something to discuss.
So thank you very much, Michelle.
Thank you, Stephanie.
So this has been another episode of From the Lighthouse. If you could please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, that would be very, very helpful. And we'll see you again in about a week. Bye.